Okay, so now let's talk about input. By the way, if you have questions, I'm just going to keep talking because I think I went too long on that. But if you have questions, please just ask. So input is such a big thing. Input from the user, such a big part of programming. I mean, we're all really kind of spoiled. I mean, I'm drawing on a tablet here with my stylus, but that's actually input from the user, right? My stylus is an input device. My touch screen, I'm scrolling around with my finger. It's a touch screen. Obviously, we're not going to write programs that advanced, but talking to and communicating and getting input from a user is an extremely important thing. And thankfully, there's a function for doing that in Python called input. And we're going to talk about what that does soon. But first, I want to do an example of using input, but I want to talk about why it's a good idea versus writing a program that doesn't use input. Let's say we have a circle with a particular radius, and I want to know the area of a circle. And that's just pi r squared. So I need some variables. Well, I can use r, but I prefer radius. And let's find 10. And so the formula for area, and I'm just going to use another variable for area, I'm just going to use 3.14. And then I need r squared. And remember, I'm using parentheses just to, you don't need to, order of operations isn't going to cause a problem. But I just want to raise radius to the power of 2. Parentheses aren't needed because of precedence. It would have done that first anyway. However, I now have the ability to write a program to calculate the area of a square of size 10, a radius of 10. So the problem with that is every time I want a different circle, I have to change that value. So what happens about if I want a 20? What happens if I want a 30? I'd have to update it manually. So let's actually do that over here. Radius equals 10. And then area equals, 3.14 times radius to the 2. And print area and 314. But now if I want to do 20, I have to retype that, grab that, put that in there, print the area. And if I want to do 30, I've got to set this again to 30 and then rerun it. But you can see that I'm constantly having to type in this 20. And if I were to make a program out of this, which I probably should, because you saw me having to reprint everything over and over again. Instead of printing everything over and over again, let's put it in a program. And put this in the same folder as last time. Area of circle. And I run this. So I get the same answer. But I want to change the code. Now I changed it. Run it again. If I want to do 30. I'm constantly changing my code. Every time I want to do a different number, I have to change my code. And that's actually could be problematic if our code was bigger. But it would be more useful if instead of doing that, we could ask the user for the radius instead. And if I could say something like, oh, just put in a 10 and then it prints out 314. That would be a much better way, right? So it would do this calculation, but it would replace it with 10. So it would do something like area 3.14 times 10 to the 2, and then it would print that out. And that's going to give me 314. So, and then I could do 20. and 30 and just get that over and over and over again. And to do that, we use that input function I just told you about. This input function takes input from the user, and we can store that input into a variable that we can use in our program. Let's do it in here first. So if I type in input, and let's actually do it from there. Notice it's stopped, right? It's just stopped. It's not doing anything. So I have to provide a value. Now if I print the radius, a value of 10 in there. So it took that 10, it stopped and waited for me to put in that 10. And it took that 10 and it did it for us. So what if we change this code now instead of, by the way, there's a name for this when you put a value as a number directly in your program. We call that hard coding, and you have to change it over and over and over again. So I don't want to do that. I want to get that data from the user instead. So I want to use that input program. This is pretty clumsy to constantly have to change this program every time I want to change things over and over again. I have to just keep doing it over and over. So now let's get the input. And so I saved it, and let's go ahead and run it. It's actually paused and waiting for me. So put in 10, and I got an error. Why did I get an error? So ignore the traceback stuff, but it told me it happened on line 2. So it happened on line 2 right there. I actually printed the line out for us. Unsupported operand type for POW, or power, string and int. Where did it come up with that string thing? The problem is that the input we get is not an integer, it's a string. So radius is actually a string right now. And that's not what we want, because we can't do mathematical operations with strings. So we have to convert that string. We have to figure out how to make that string into something we can use. And there's 2 functions that we can use. And the 2 functions that we can use, and we're going to cover these a little bit more later, is float. Actually, I'm going to say expression. Although, yeah, it's expression. It can convert other things too, and integer. So these 2 functions can take an expression and turn it into a float or an integer. So which one should we use? Well, the answer to that is, because we're dealing with floating point numbers anyway, 3.14, and we could have circles of radius 1.5, 1.9, 2.5. It makes sense to use float. So we're actually getting a string, and we need to convert that string back into a number, in this case a float, so that when we run this, we get radius to the power of 2. It's actually going to use a floating point number and raise that to the power of 2 instead of using the string. So input gives us strings. Always, input gives us strings. So if we go back up here to input, it gets a string from the user. And also it waits until you actually hit enter. And your program pauses until you hit enter. So using float, we can take a string, and now we can turn that thing into a number. And now we get a working program. And that was the 314 we were getting earlier. Now we run it again. And I put 20. run it again, and now I could do something I haven't done yet, 100. I just keep running it over and over and over again. I don't have to change my code. I don't have to worry about introducing any more problems. The input allows me to configure a program so that a user could just use that thing over and over again without having to touch the code. Example, what if you send this program to a friend and say, don't touch the code because you don't know how to program, but here's how you run it. And then just put a number in there every time and it'll tell you over and over again. So you could share that with people who don't know how to code because you don't want them actually editing the code if they don't know what they're doing. So input is a great way, or in fact, the only way at this point, but it's a great way of actually extending our programs to allow the human running our program to actually do stuff.